Illinois, 1967. A small-town cold case that haunted generations has finally been solved. Daniel Whitaker, a 20-year-old gas station attendant known for his quiet kindness and steady work ethic, vanished one humid summer night along a lonely stretch of Route 24. His car was found idling by the roadside, headlights cutting through the dark, but Daniel was gone. For decades, rumors swirled. Police chased dead ends, evidence vanished, and whispers of corruption clouded the truth. Families grew older. Witnesses faded. Justice, it seemed, would never come, until now. Decades later, DNA from a forgotten evidence box would expose a chilling secret, and a killer hiding in plain sight. Before we begin, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Peoria, Illinois, 1967, a town that felt like the heart of America. Church bells on Sunday mornings, baseball in the summer air, and gas prices that barely reached 30 cents a gallon. Life moved slow here, predictable, safe, and for Daniel Whitaker, a 20-year-old gas station attendant, that predictability was everything he'd ever wanted. Daniel lived with his mother, Ruth, in a modest two-story home just outside town. His father, a Korean War veteran, had passed when Daniel was a boy. Since then, Daniel had become both son and man of the house, fixing broken steps, tuning the old radio, keeping the car running when money got tight. He wasn't just dependable. He was steady. Everyone in their small neighborhood knew that if something broke, Danny could fix it. Every morning, he walked the same route to Whitman's Gas and Service on Main Street. The place smelled of oil, cigarettes, and the faint sweetness of gasoline, a scent Daniel oddly liked. He worked 6 days a week, sometimes 12 hours at a stretch, wiping grease from his hands on a rag tucked into his back pocket. To passing truckers, he was the kid who smiled even when tired. To his boss, he was the kind of worker you didn't have to watch. Outside of work, Daniel led a quiet life. On warm evenings, he'd stop by Mary's Diner, a small corner cafe with checkered floors and pie that always sold out before noon. There, he'd order coffee and sit in the last booth sketching in his notebook. Not people, but gears, carburetors, and parts of engines he wanted to build someday. He dreamed of going to trade school in Chicago, maybe even opening his own shop. His mother supported him, though she worried what leaving home would mean. Friends would sometimes join him, talking about cars, local gossip, and music. He wasn't loud or flashy. Daniel wasn't the kind of young man who chased trouble. He was the kind who waved at old ladies crossing the street and carried groceries for strangers. But even in a small town like Peoria, danger had a way of hiding in plain sight. Unseen eyes sometimes lingered too long at the station. Late-night customers pulled in with shadows on their faces. Still, Daniel brushed it off. He believed good people outnumbered the bad, that Peoria was safe. At home, Ruth often waited on the porch, a soft light glowing from the living room window. When he came home late, he'd kiss her forehead and tell her not to worry. She'd smile and say, "You're just like your father, always working too hard." But that July felt different. Maybe it was the heat, a thick, heavy kind that made tempers short and nights restless. There had been whispers of petty thefts, strange cars parked near the edge of town, unfamiliar faces at the diner. Ruth noticed her son seemed quieter, thoughtful. He mentioned feeling uneasy closing the station alone. "It's nothing," he said. "Probably just my imagination." That summer, Peoria's sense of safety began to crack, tiny fractures no one yet noticed. The hum of the gas pumps, the chime of the station bell, ordinary sounds that would soon carry a different weight. Daniel didn't know that his next few days would be his last ordinary ones. He didn't know that the dreams scribbled in his notebook would never leave those pages. Because in a town that trusted its own, evil was about to wear a familiar face. And on one quiet July night in 1967, Daniel Whitaker would fail to come home, leaving behind only questions that would haunt Peoria for generations. What would happen the night Daniel failed to come home? July 12, 1967, the day Peoria lost its sense of safety. The heat hung thick that evening, the kind that made even the cicadas go quiet. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and Main Street glowed in the orange wash of flickering streetlights. At Whitman's Gas and Service, Daniel Whitaker finished wiping down the pumps, his hands stained with oil and dust. His co-worker, Tom Redding, was already counting the register. "See you tomorrow, Danny," he said, locking the cash box. Daniel smiled, tired but content. He had just enough in his pocket for a late-night soda on the way home. At 10 p.m., he slid into his blue Ford Fairlane, the same car he'd rebuilt with his father's old tools. The engine rumbled to life. Tom watched from the doorway as Daniel waved once, that quiet, familiar gesture Peoria knew so well. It was the last time anyone would see him alive. The road home was a simple one, Route 24 eastbound, past the old train crossing, then a right turn toward his mother's house. 15 minutes, no more. But somewhere between the gas station and the bend at Kickapoo Creek, Daniel vanished. Just before midnight, a long-haul truck driver named Charles Ames noticed something odd. About a mile outside town, headlights pierced the darkness, unmoving. As he slowed, he saw a car idling at the shoulder, driver's door open. The engine was running, radio faintly playing the Four Tops. Daniel's Ford Fairlane sat half on the gravel, one shoe lying in the dirt beside the open door. No driver, no movement. Ames called it in from the nearest payphone. When police arrived, the car was still running. The driver's seat was pushed back slightly, as if someone taller had been behind the wheel. Daniel's wallet was missing, but his keys hung in the ignition. A flashlight and service rag lay on the passenger seat. The clock read 11:42 p.m. When officers went to the Whitaker residence around 2 a.m., Ruth answered the door in her robe, hair unpinned, eyes wide. "He's not home yet?" she whispered, as if saying it might make it untrue. She had waited on the porch until after midnight, her coffee going cold. By dawn, the search began. Volunteers combed the ditches and cornfields. Police dogs traced scent trails that faded near the creek. Helicopters swept over farmland and local fishermen dragged the riverbanks. But each lead ended in the same silence. The next morning's paper carried the headline, "Local gas attendant missing. Car found abandoned on Route 24. The photo of the Fairlane, door open, lights still on, became an image seared into Peoria's collective memory. Rumors spread fast. Some said he'd run away. Others whispered about hitchhikers or highway robberies. But Ruth refused to believe it. "My Danny wouldn't leave me," she told reporters, clutching his photo. Something happened to him. Somebody knows. Days passed with no progress. Detectives interviewed co-workers, customers, and anyone who'd passed through the gas station that night. But every account was the same. Daniel closed up, smiled, drove off. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. As the July heat baked the fields, frustration grew. Residents organized nightly searches, carrying lanterns and flashlights through the dark. The sheriff's department kept insisting Daniel might have wandered off. But locals knew better. You don't just wander off and leave your car running. In small towns, word travels faster than fact. By the end of the week, Peoria wasn't just worried, it was afraid. Parents started locking doors. Teenagers stayed off Route 24 after sunset. The night Daniel Whitaker disappeared had changed something fundamental. Because in that 15-minute stretch of highway, between a boy's shift ending and his mother's waiting light, something unimaginable had happened. Where had Daniel gone between the gas station and his home? It was the morning of July 15, 1967, 3 days since Daniel Whitaker had vanished into the dark stretch of Route 24. The town was restless. Volunteers still searched the riverbanks and fields, though hope was beginning to fade. Then, just after noon, 2 local teenagers, Mark and Jerry Fields, decided to explore the trails near Kickapoo Creek, a shaded area about 2 miles from where Daniel's car had been found. They were looking for nothing more than a quiet spot to fish. What they found instead would scar them for life. At first, it was just a shape in the mud, something dull, almost unnoticeable among the cattails. Mark stepped closer and froze. It was a boot, half sunk, the leather darkened by water and time. It looked too clean to be old. Then only a few feet away they saw him. Daniel Whitaker's body lay face down near the waterline, one arm bent unnaturally beneath him. His shirt was torn down the side, one sleeve soaked through with blood and creek water. His hair clung to his forehead. There were drag marks nearby, long, uneven streaks where someone had pulled him through the brush. His wallet was gone, but his driver's license and car keys were still in his pocket. Most chilling of all was the deep purplish bruise that wrapped around his neck. The boys ran until their throats burned, flagging down a farmer who called the police. Within the hour, sirens echoed across the quiet countryside. Deputies arrived first, followed by state investigators. The area was cordoned off with yellow tape, but word spread fast. Within hours, a crowd gathered along the dirt road, neighbors and strangers standing shoulder to shoulder, whispering and praying. Peoria had lost its innocence. Detectives took photographs, but heavy rain the night before had erased much of the evidence. Footprints along the bank blurred into nothing. Cigarette butts and bottle caps littered the ground, impossible to tell which mattered. Some onlookers, desperate for a glimpse, crossed the tape before officers could stop them, trampling what little remained untouched. The coroner's van arrived just after 3 p.m. Ruth Whitaker received the news before evening fell. A knock at the door, 2 officers in uniform, hats in hand. Her scream echoed down the block. For years afterward, neighbors would say they still remembered that sound. The sound of a mother learning her child was gone. The official report came later that night. Cause of death: strangulation. Time of death: estimated late evening, July 12th. No defensive wounds on his hands, no sign of a struggle near the site. The medical examiner believed Daniel had been killed elsewhere and dragged to the creek. The police quickly called it a robbery gone wrong. Daniel's wallet and watch were missing, and one of his pockets was turned inside out, but not everyone believed it. His mother insisted he carried very little cash, certainly not enough to justify murder. Danny wasn't robbed, she told the Peoria Journal-Star. Someone wanted to hurt him, someone he knew. Within days, theories ran rampant. Some thought it was a drifter passing through town. Others whispered about jealous co-workers, an ex-girlfriend, or even a police cover-up. Yet none of it made sense. Daniel was kind, soft-spoken, and had no known enemies. Still, one thing was clear: this wasn't random chaos. The bruising on his neck suggested control, rage, something deeply personal. Someone had wanted him silenced. As the sun set over Peoria, the headlines shifted from missing gas attendant to young man found murdered. And with every passing hour, grief began to harden into suspicion. The town that once trusted everyone now looked at each other differently. Was this a random act of violence, or something far more personal? The murder of Daniel Whitaker shook Peoria to its core. For a community unaccustomed to violence, the idea that someone among them could be responsible felt unbearable. In the days following the discovery, the Peoria County Sheriff's Office promised swift justice. "We're following strong leads," they told reporters. But behind closed doors, the investigation was already unraveling. Detectives began with interviews: friends, co-workers, anyone who'd seen Daniel the night he disappeared. They questioned his boss at Whitman's Gas and Service, his regular customers, even a few truckers who passed through that evening. Nothing solid emerged. Everyone described Daniel as polite, helpful, and quiet. No arguments, no debts, no trouble. Attention soon turned to strangers. A group of drifters had been spotted camping near the rail yard that week. Police rounded them up, questioned them for hours, and released them the same day. One man, a mechanic named Earl Denning, drew particular interest. He'd worked briefly at a nearby auto shop before being fired for fighting. Rumor had it he'd asked Daniel for money a week before the murder. Detectives interrogated him for nearly 12 hours. He denied everything. His alibi, drinking at a tavern across town, checked out. By the next morning, he was gone. Then came the tire tracks. A deputy discovered them along a dirt path near Kickapoo Creek, just yards from where Daniel's body was found. The prints looked like they belonged to a delivery truck, but no clear match could be made. When the plaster casts were taken to the lab, they were later reported damaged. Some said they were mishandled. Others whispered they had been lost entirely. Weeks turned into months. What began as a full-scale investigation slowly shrank to a few overworked detectives and mounting public frustration. Files were misplaced, statements rewritten, evidence misfiled. One officer, speaking anonymously to a reporter, claimed a relative of a local lawman had once been questioned, but the report vanished from the case file soon after. The implication was enough to ignite whispers of corruption. By fall, the Peoria Journal-Star ran an editorial titled, "Who Killed Daniel Whitaker?" It criticized the lack of transparency, hinting that politics might be hindering justice. The sheriff dismissed it as sensationalism, but the damage was done. People began to doubt the investigation altogether. Meanwhile, the Whitaker family lived in limbo. Ruth attended every public meeting, clutching a worn photograph of her son. "He was all I had," she told reporters, voice trembling. "I just want to know who did this." The department promised answers but gave her none. Behind the scenes, detectives followed new leads, or what little they had left. A knife found near the creek turned out unrelated. A witness claimed to have seen Daniel arguing with someone days before his death, but her description changed each time she spoke. There were theories of a jealous lover, a robbery gone wrong, even a cover-up involving local law enforcement. Each possibility dissolved under lack of proof. By winter, the once busy police station grew quiet. Case folders gathered dust. The townspeople stopped asking questions out loud, though fear lingered like fog. Parents warned their children not to walk home after dark. Teenagers whispered about the Route 24 killer, a name that haunted every late-night conversation. But for Ruth Whitaker, the silence was worse than fear. It meant no one was looking anymore. It meant Daniel's case, like so many others, was slipping away. Some residents believed the police were hiding something. Others thought they were simply outmatched. But in the heart of Peoria, one chilling question remained. Were the police protecting someone, or were they simply out of leads? By 1969, 2 years after Daniel Whitaker's murder, the investigation had hit a wall. Every lead had been chased, every suspect questioned, every theory tested, and yet the truth remained just out of reach. The file that once filled desks and bulletin boards was now tucked into a gray cabinet marked unsolved. Detectives who'd once vowed to bring closure to the Whitaker family began moving on to other cases. "We did what we could," one officer told a local reporter that spring. "Sometimes justice takes time." But time was the one thing that never worked in Daniel's favor. Witnesses moved away, memories faded, and small but vital details slipped through the cracks. By early 1970, Daniel's case was officially inactive. That word, inactive, became the quiet burial of his story. His mother, Ruth, never accepted it. She left his bedroom exactly as it was the night he vanished, the bed neatly made, a small model car half assembled on his desk, a calendar frozen on July 12, 1967. Each morning, she'd walk past that door and whisper, "Good morning, Danny," as though he were still asleep inside. The town around her changed. The old gas station closed in the mid-70s, replaced by a convenience store. The sign out front was repainted, but locals still called it Whitaker's. Teenagers would park there at night telling stories about the boy who disappeared and the mystery that never went away. Some said his ghost haunted the creek. Others said justice was still waiting to be found. For Ruth, there was nothing ghostly about her pain, only the hollow echo of loss that never softened. Each July, she placed fresh flowers near the old bridge by Kickapoo Creek. No one had to ask why. They all knew. Occasionally, the Peoria Journal-Star ran small anniversary pieces. Still no leads in 1967 Whitaker case. A new generation of journalists mentioned it in passing, often pairing it with other local cold cases. True crime columnists from Chicago included it in regional roundups, labeling it one of Illinois' most baffling unsolved murders. Yet no one ever dug deeper. The case had become history, a story people remembered but no longer questioned. Meanwhile, evidence sat quietly in the basement of the sheriff's department. A single cardboard box marked Whitaker D held everything. Crime scene photos, autopsy notes, and a few small plastic bags containing Daniel's torn shirt and soil samples. Over the years, that box would be moved, relabeled, and forgotten, but it never disappeared. It waited. The detectives who first handled the case began to retire. Some passed away. New officers came through the department, but few knew the name Daniel Whitaker beyond the fading headlines. By the 1980s, Peoria had grown, modernized, and diversified. The town that once whispered about Daniel's death now focused on new problems, new crimes. Still, every so often, someone would mention his name. A teacher recalling the case to a criminology class. A retired officer sipping coffee at the diner, shaking his head and saying, "That one still bothers me." And then there was Ruth. Older now, walking slower, her hair grayer, but her resolve unbroken. She wrote letters to police chiefs, local news stations, even the governor's office. Most went unanswered. She was a fixture in Peoria, the mother who never stopped asking. Her persistence kept Daniel's story alive, even when the rest of the world forgot. Yet by the time the 1990s arrived, the trail was as cold as the day his body was found. The box sat untouched. The truth sealed inside waited for someone with the right tools, the right time, and the right determination to open it. Would anyone ever reopen the box that held the truth? By 2003, the world had changed in ways that investigators of the 1960s could never have imagined. Computers now stored what once filled file cabinets, and the science of DNA had become the new voice for the voiceless. That year, Illinois launched a statewide initiative to digitize and re-examine unsolved crimes. Hundreds of forgotten boxes from police archives across the state, each one carrying the silent weight of lives cut short. One of those boxes bore a fading label, Whitaker. To inside were the remnants of a life frozen in time. Black and white photos, water-damaged reports, and a single sealed evidence bag containing a torn shirt fragment. The shirt had been removed from Daniel Whitaker's body in 1967 and stored away before anyone could have known its future importance. Forensic analyst Claire Donovan was among the first assigned to the Peoria Archive Project. She wasn't old enough to remember the Whitaker case, but she'd heard the name whispered by senior officers. Late one evening, as she sorted through a backlog of cold files, she decided to test the fabric sample for trace DNA. The technology had improved dramatically. New methods could isolate genetic material invisible to the eye. Even from decades-old fibers, no one expected a result. Most evidence from that era was too degraded. But when the machine beeped and the monitor displayed a partial match, Claire's heart began to race. She ran the analysis again to be sure. The sequence aligned with a profile in the national database, not from a murder but from a 1974 assault case in Macoupin County. The suspect in that case had been convicted but released years earlier, Robert Hensley. Hensley wasn't a stranger to Peoria. Archived records showed he'd worked as a delivery driver for a fuel supplier that serviced local gas stations, including Whitman's Gas and Service, where Daniel had worked. The connection was chilling. When detectives pulled Hensley's old employment records, a disturbing timeline emerged. In July 1967, he was assigned deliveries in Peoria County. 2 weeks after Daniel's murder, Hensley abruptly quit and moved south. His resignation was never investigated. Back then, no one had linked him to the case. Detective Mark Sanderson, leading the cold case review, recalled, "It was like watching a ghost take shape. The more they dug, the more coincidences turned into patterns. Witness statements from 1967 mentioned a dark truck parked near Route 24 around the time Daniel vanished. Hensley had driven a delivery truck, same make, same color. The evidence that once seemed ordinary now painted a different picture. Investigators compared the 1974 assault victim's statement with Daniel's case details. Both victims had been strangled, both attacked near isolated roads. The method was identical. It wasn't chance. Police began reconstructing Hensley's movements, contacting surviving witnesses, and revisiting the long-forgotten paper trail. Many who remembered him described him as quiet but quick-tempered. Others mentioned how he often lingered at the gas station after hours. But even with the match, the team needed absolute certainty. After nearly 4 decades, the law demanded airtight proof. A secondary test confirmed it. The DNA found on Daniel's shirt belonged to Robert Hensley, a 1 in 1 billion genetic probability. News of the breakthrough spread through the department in hushed disbelief. Officers who'd been rookies in the late 60s called one another, stunned that the case might finally be closing. For Ruth Whitaker, now in her 70s, the call came one autumn afternoon. "Mrs. Whitaker," the detective told her, "we think we found him." After 36 years of silence, Daniel's case had come alive again. But even with science on their side, the question loomed heavy in every detective's mind. Was this a coincidence? Or had they truly found Daniel Whitaker's killer? It was a gray morning in March 2004 when 2 Peoria County detectives, accompanied by state police, pulled up to a small ranch-style home outside Springfield, Illinois. The neighborhood was quiet, birds cutting through the cool air, unaware that history was about to shift. Inside that house lived Robert Hensley, a retired delivery driver, husband, and grandfather. For nearly 40 years, he had gone about his life unnoticed, carrying a secret buried deeper than time itself. Detective Mark Sanderson stood at the door, warrant in hand. "Mr. Hensley," he said as the man opened it, "we'd like to ask you some questions about a case from 1967. At first, Hensley looked confused, even curious. "That was a long time ago," he muttered, his voice roughened by years of smoking. But when Sanderson mentioned the name Daniel Whitaker, something changed. His expression stiffened. His hands, which had been resting casually on the doorframe, began to tremble. The detectives explained the DNA evidence, the match between a sample found on Daniel's shirt and Hensley's own genetic profile, stored from his 1974 assault conviction. Hensley's face drained of color. He shook his head slowly. "I don't know any Whitaker," he insisted. "Never heard of him." But the detectives pressed. They presented photographs from 1967, grainy images of the gas station, the truck tire impressions near the creek, and copies of witness statements describing a dark fuel truck parked on Route 24 that night. The make and model matched Hensley's delivery vehicle from the company records. "We have enough to bring you in," Sanderson said quietly. Hensley's wife emerged from the hallway, confusion turning to horror as officers stepped forward with handcuffs. "Robert, what's going on?" she asked, her voice shaking. He didn't answer. The man who had lived an ordinary life for decades was led away, the weight of 1967 finally catching up to him. Word spread through Peoria faster than anyone expected. Within hours of the arrest, headlines filled local papers. "Cold case breakthrough, suspect arrested in 1967 Whitaker murder." For older residents, it was like opening an old wound that had never healed. Some wept. Others were angry that justice had taken so long. The same stretch of Route 24 that once represented small-town calm now symbolized betrayal and loss. Reporters gathered outside Ruth Whitaker's home that evening. Now in her 70s, she stepped onto the porch with tears in her eyes. "I prayed for this," she said softly. "Every night I prayed that God wouldn't let him die without facing what he did." Hensley was transported back to Peoria under heavy security. During questioning, he maintained his innocence, claiming the DNA evidence was a mistake and that he had nothing to do with that boy. Investigators, however, uncovered more. An old coworker who remembered Hensley growing agitated the summer Daniel died, complaining about some punk kid at a station who talked too much. The pieces were aligning, but so were the challenges. After nearly 40 years, physical evidence had deteriorated, witnesses had aged, and memories blurred. The defense would argue contamination, procedural errors, even mishandled evidence from the 1960s. Detectives knew that securing a conviction wouldn't be easy. Science had reopened the case, but human memory would have to close it. Still, for the first time since 1967, there was hope. A name, a face, a chance at accountability. As news crews packed the courthouse steps and old-timers murmured in disbelief, one question echoed through every corner of Peoria, from the diner booths to the church pews to the overgrown field by Kickapoo Creek. Would decades-old evidence be enough to convict Robert Hensley in court? The trial of Robert Hensley began in the spring of 2005, nearly 38 years after Daniel Whitaker's death. By then, the story had gripped Illinois. Reporters filled the courthouse steps in Peoria, cameras flashing as the accused, now an aging man with gray hair and deep lines carved into his face, was escorted through the front doors. The quiet, almost forgotten town that once tried to bury its pain was about to relive every moment of it in public. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric, tense, and heavy with history. Every seat was filled. Retired officers, old friends of Daniel, even strangers who remembered the headlines from 1967 came to witness what they called the trial that time almost erased. For Ruth Whitaker, now in her late 70s, each day was both torture and vindication. She sat in the front row, clutching a worn photograph of her son, the same one she'd carried to every press interview, every memorial, every prayer vigil for nearly 4 decades. The prosecution opened with one sentence that set the tone: "Science does not forget." Prosecutor Elaine Garvey laid out the story, the cold case, the DNA discovery, the link to Hensley's past. Jurors watched as evidence once thought useless was projected on a large screen, the faded shirt fragment now holding the key that time had concealed. Experts explained how the genetic profile matched Robert Hensley with a probability of 1 in a billion. Witness after witness was called. an old co-worker recalling Hensley's short temper, a surviving detective who admitted that the original investigation was flawed, and a retired cellmate who claimed Hensley once bragged about making a boy disappear after an argument at a gas station. The courtroom gasped. Though the defense called the story unreliable, the timing of that confession, made years before the DNA link existed, was impossible to ignore. Hensley's attorney countered fiercely. He argued that evidence stored for nearly 40 years could not be trusted. Contamination, degradation, human error, and this case is built on dust, he told the jury. He questioned every detail: the missing files, the mishandled tire casts, the long chain of custody. He reminded the court that memory fades, that witnesses confuse, that science, even as advanced as it was, could be imperfect. But the prosecution leaned on the one thing that hadn't changed: the DNA. They presented laboratory records, cross-checked by multiple independent analysts. "This isn't memory," Garvey said. "This is molecular truth. It's Daniel Whitaker speaking through time." Over the weeks, emotion filled the courtroom. When Ruth was called to testify, her voice trembled but did not break. "He was my only child," she said, "and I've been waiting 38 years to sit in this room." Her words left jurors visibly shaken. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated for 3 long days. Reporters camped outside, the courthouse surrounded by news vans and townspeople holding candles in quiet vigils. Finally, on a humid Friday afternoon, the foreman stood and spoke the word that ended nearly 4 decades of silence: guilty. Gasps filled the courtroom. Ruth's shoulders shook as she whispered, "Thank you." Hensley sat motionless, eyes fixed on the floor. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without parole. Yet when the gavel fell, the relief was bittersweet. The verdict couldn't bring Daniel back or erase the decades lost to uncertainty. It couldn't undo the mistakes of a broken investigation, but it proved that justice, even delayed, was still possible. And as the courthouse emptied, the question lingered in the air, quiet but powerful. How many other cases were still buried by neglect, waiting for science to speak for the voiceless? What did this long-delayed justice truly mean for Peoria and for Daniel's legacy? In the months following Robert Hensley's conviction, Peoria began to heal. Not quickly, not completely, but with a quiet sense of release that had been missing for decades. For many who had grown up under the shadow of Daniel Whitaker's unsolved murder, justice felt like a long-lost relative finally coming home. The Whitaker case soon became more than a local headline. It became a turning point. Illinois lawmakers, inspired by the attention surrounding the trial, began discussing statewide cold case reform. The media called it the Whitaker effect. News outlets ran in-depth features about the dangers of forgotten evidence and the importance of preserving samples for future testing. What began as a tragedy in 1967 became a catalyst for change in 2005. One of the first reforms was the establishment of a state-funded cold case DNA unit, designed to re-examine evidence from unsolved murders dating back half a century. Legislators cited Daniel's case in the bill's introduction. "No family should wait 40 years for a knock on the door," one senator said during a public session. Ruth Whitaker's persistence had become a symbol of endurance, a mother's unwavering belief that her son's story still mattered. In Peoria, tributes began to appear. Local high school students, moved by the case, created a mural downtown titled "Echoes of Justice," depicting Daniel's Ford Fairlane beneath a rising sun. Churches held vigils not just for Daniel, but for all victims whose stories were trapped in time. Even decades later, the name Whitaker carried weight, not as a symbol of tragedy, but as a reminder of perseverance. True crime journalists revisited the story in articles and television features. National documentaries and podcasts followed. Cold Truth: The Whitaker Case aired on public television, exploring how one evidence fragment reshaped an entire field of forensic science. Listeners were drawn to Ruth's journey, her letters to police, her faith, her refusal to let bureaucracy bury her son's memory. By 2008, Peoria had turned the site of Whitman's Gas and Service into a small community park. A bronze plaque was placed near the entrance, engraved with simple words, "Justice Never Forgets," in memory of Daniel Whitaker, 1947-1967. Visitors often left flowers, coins, or handwritten notes beneath it. Some were from residents who remembered the summer of his death. Others from strangers who had only learned his name through a screen or podcast but felt connected nonetheless. Ruth lived long enough to see the memorial unveiled. She stood before the crowd, her voice weak but steady. "Daniel's gone," she said, "but justice didn't die with him. It just took time to find its way home." Those words were quoted in newspapers across the state. She passed away a year later, buried beside her son, finally at peace. In the years since, the Whitaker case has been studied in criminology programs and forensic workshops. It taught new generations of investigators that time doesn't erase evidence, only neglect does. It proved that technology could give a voice to those silenced long ago, if only someone cared enough to listen. For Peoria, the story lingered not as a scar, but as a lesson. It reminded the town that beneath every cold case file was a family still waiting, still hoping. Daniel's story became their reminder that truth, no matter how late it arrives, still has the power to heal. Standing by the quiet stretch of Route 24 today, the sound of passing cars echoes through the fields where Daniel once drove home. The wind carries whispers of closure, not perfect, not complete but real, and so the question remains, carved not in stone but in memory. How do we measure justice, by the years lost or by the truth finally found? The resolution of the Daniel Whitaker cold case, nearly 40 years after his death, stands as both a triumph of perseverance and a reminder of how fragile justice can be. It revealed not only the shortcomings of early police work, but also the quiet, unwavering power of love and faith. What once seemed lost in the fog of time was reclaimed through science, patience, and one mother's refusal to forget. Ruth Whitaker's words on the day of the verdict, "He can rest now," carried far beyond the courtroom. They echoed through generations of families who had lost loved ones to silence, and through investigators who'd spent years chasing answers buried under dust and neglect. Those simple words became a testament to belief that justice delayed is not justice denied, that truth, though buried, can rise again. The 1967 Peoria murder that once defined despair became a catalyst for reform. It reshaped how Illinois handled evidence, inspired new funding for forensic technology, and reminded law enforcement that every sealed box might still contain a heartbeat from the past. Daniel's case became a model taught in classrooms and discussed at conferences, a living proof that persistence and innovation can bridge the impossible gap between decades. Daniel Whitaker's life was short, his story unfinished for far too long, yet in the end it became more than a tragedy when it became a legacy. A symbol of endurance, justice, and memory, because even after decades of silence, the truth still speaks. If you believe every victim deserves to be heard, share Daniel's story and keep their names alive. Justice lives on when we remember.